August 12, 2023. Johnson County Fair, Iowa. Equipment Demonstration Day. That's where it happened, where everything changed, where the entire county watched Preston Blake make the biggest mistake of his life, and where 74-year-old Walter Morrison accepted a challenge everyone knew he couldn't win. Preston Blake owned Blake Farm Equipment, the largest John Deere dealership in 3 counties, drove a $90,000 truck, wore designer jeans to farm events, and had made a fortune selling new tractors to farmers who couldn't really afford them. Walter Morrison owned 160 acres, drove a 1991 Ford Ranger with rust holes, wore overalls he'd owned since 1987, and farmed with a 1952 Farmall M he'd bought for $800 in 1979. They hated each other. The equipment demonstration was Preston's show. He'd sponsored it, brought his newest inventory, set up a display that looked like a dealership showroom in the middle of the fairgrounds. The centerpiece was a brand new John Deere 8R410, fresh off the truck, gleaming green and yellow, $485,000 worth of cutting-edge technology, 410 horsepower, GPS guidance, auto steer, every bell and whistle John Deere offered. Preston was giving his pitch to a crowd of about 200 farmers. "Gentlemen, this is the future of farming. 410 horsepower, integrated technology, precision agriculture capability. This tractor can do in one day what used to take a week." That's when Walter walked past with his grandson, heading toward the livestock barns. Preston saw him and couldn't resist. Well, if it isn't Walter Morrison. Folks, here's a man who's still farming like it's 1952, running equipment so old it belongs in a museum. The crowd turned to look. Walter stopped walking. Preston was smiling, playing to the audience. "Walter, you still running that ancient Farmall? What is it, 70 years old now?" 71, Walter said quietly. "Still runs fine." Preston laughed, and several people in the crowd laughed with him. "Still runs fine," he says. "Folks, this is what I'm competing against. Farmers who think a tractor from the Truman administration is fine." Walter's grandson, Tommy, 16 years old, put his hand on his grandfather's arm. "Grandpa, let's just go." But Walter was looking at Preston with an expression that made the laughter die down. "That Farmall has plowed more acres than you've seen in your life, Preston." Preston's smile got wider, meaner. "Maybe so, but I bet this John Deere here could outwork your antique any day of the week. Hell, it could probably outwork it in half a day." Someone in the crowd said, "Oh," anticipating conflict. Walter's voice stayed calm. "You really believe that?" "I don't believe it, Walter. I know it. That's the difference between modern equipment and your junkyard special." The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing something building. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to prove it?" Preston's eyes lit up. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we settle this. Your John Deere against my Farmall. Real competition. Let's see which one's actually better." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Preston's smile went predatory. "Old man, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You've been running your mouth about new equipment being better for 20 years. Let's prove it." Preston looked at his new tractor, then at Walter, and saw an opportunity to humiliate the old farmer in front of the entire county. "All right, you want a competition? Let's make it interesting. We'll have a plowing contest, 40 acres. Whoever finishes first with the best quality work wins." "And what are we betting?" someone in the crowd called out. Preston hadn't thought that far, but he was committed now. "How about this? Loser pays the winner $10,000. The crowd gasped. $10,000 was real money. Tommy grabbed his grandfather's arm. "Grandpa, we don't have $10,000.
Walter kept his eyes on Preston. "I don't need $10,000 to know my tractor will outwork yours." Preston's face flushed. "So you're backing out?" "I'm saying, Let's make the bet worth something real. Loser pays $10,000 and admits publicly that they were wrong, that the other person's equipment is superior. Preston extended his hand. Deal. We'll do it next Saturday. Carl Johnson's got that 80-acre section that needs plowing. We'll each take 40 acres. First one done with quality work wins. They shook hands, and the crowd went crazy. People pulling out phones, posting to Facebook, calling friends who weren't there. By that evening, everyone in Johnson County knew about the challenge. Walter Morrison's 71-year-old Farmall M versus Preston Blake's brand-new $485,000 John Deere 8R410. The old farmer, who could barely afford diesel, versus the wealthy dealer who sold million-dollar equipment packages. The underdog everyone loved versus the arrogant businessman everyone resented. And $10,000 on the line. People were already placing side bets. The general consensus was 95-5 in favor of Preston. There was simply no way a tractor from 1952 could compete with modern machinery. Walter's friends called him that night. "Walt, what were you thinking? You can't beat a brand new John Deere with that old Farmall." Walter's response was always the same. "We'll see." His wife, Eleanor, was less diplomatic. "Elward Morrison, we don't have $10,000 to lose. What happens when Preston beats you?" Walter was in his shed, checking over the Farmall, running his hands over metal he'd maintained for 44 years. "He's not going to beat me, Ellie." "How can you possibly know that?" Walter looked at his tractor, faded red paint, worn seat, gauges that didn't all work anymore, but an engine that purred like the day it was built. Because Preston thinks farming is about horsepower and technology. He's wrong. Farming is about understanding your equipment, understanding your soil, understanding efficiency. That's not going to matter when his tractor has 410 horsepower and yours has 38. Walter smiled. That's exactly why it's going to matter. 7 days until the competition. 7 days for Preston to brag to everyone who'd listen about how he was going to humiliate the old farmer. 7 days for Walter to prepare.
7 days until the entire county learned that sometimes the old ways aren't outdated. They're just smarter than people remember. The hatred between Preston Blaike and Walter Morrison went back 6 years to 2017, when Preston had tried to buy Walter's 160 acres for development. A wealthy investor wanted to build a housing subdivision, and Preston was brokering the deal for a $200,000 commission, offering Walter $1.2 million for land that was only worth $800,000 on the agricultural market. And everyone in the county expected Walter to take it because he was 70. His wife had health issues, they were barely scraping by, and retirement with over $1 million would have solved every problem they had. Walter had said no, had told Preston that some things mattered more than money, that his father had bought this land in 1943 and Walter had promised to keep it farming, that he'd rather die broke on his own land than rich in some retirement home, and Preston had lost his mind, had called Walter a fool and an old man stuck in the past, had told him he'd regret it when the bank took the farm anyway. Preston had been right about one thing. Walter had almost lost the farm in 2019 when Eleanor needed surgery and medical bills piled up faster than crop income could cover them. Walter had been 60 days from foreclosure when he'd done something desperate. He'd sold every piece of equipment he owned, except the Farmall M, had liquidated a lifetime of accumulated machinery for $47,000, which barely covered the medical debt and bought him enough time to restructure his farm loan. The Farmall M was all he had left because he'd bought it outright for cash in 1979 and nobody could take it from him, and he'd proven something that shocked everyone, including himself. He could farm 160 acres with one ancient tractor through sheer determination, knowledge, and perfectly maintained equipment. He'd done it for 4 years now, planting and harvesting and managing every operation with that 1952 Farmall M, working longer hours and smarter methods than farmers with 10 times his equipment. Preston had used this as evidence that Walter was a failure, would tell customers at his dealership, "You want to end up like Walter Morrison, farming with a 70-year-old tractor because you can't afford anything else? Then don't invest in proper equipment. See where that gets you." And the comment would always get back to Walter, would burn like acid, because Preston was using Walter's hardship, which had been caused by saving his wife's life, as a sales tactic to shame other farmers into buying equipment they couldn't afford. The Farmall M itself was a legend in Johnson County, not because it was special or rare, but because of what Walter had done with it. He'd bought it in 1979 from a widow whose husband had died, paid $800 for a tractor that hadn't run in 3 years. Everyone told him he'd wasted his money on junk, but Walter had spent 6 months rebuilding it completely, had learned every system, every part, every quirk, had maintained it religiously for 44 years, and the tractor had never let him down, never had a major breakdown, never failed when he needed it.
The engine was original, never rebuilt, running on the same block that had been cast in 1952, but Walter had kept the oil changed, the filters clean, the cooling system maintained, had treated that tractor like a partner rather than a tool, and it had rewarded him with reliability that new equipment couldn't match. Preston's John Deere 8R410, by contrast, was a $485,000 marvel of modern engineering that Preston had never actually farmed with. He owned it as a demonstrator, used it for shows and promotions, let potential customers test drive it, but Preston himself hadn't farmed in 15 years, had inherited his father's dealership and turned it into a sales empire without ever getting his hands dirty. And that was the fundamental difference between the two men. Walter knew farming, Preston knew selling. The community's reaction to the bet split along predictable lines. Younger farmers, the ones who'd bought new equipment from Preston and believed in technology, thought Walter was going to get destroyed, posted on Facebook about how the old man was finally going to learn that progress matters, that you can't compete with modern machinery using antiques. Older farmers, the ones who remembered when Walter was young and farming with equipment that was advanced for its time, weren't so sure. They knew Walter's reputation for precision, knew he could squeeze more productivity out of that Farmall than seemed physically possible, knew that he'd survived 4 years farming with just that one tractor, which suggested he understood something about efficiency that the younger generation had forgotten. By Wednesday, 3 days before the competition, the county extension office had gotten so many calls asking about it that they'd officially sanctioned the event, brought in judges, established rules. Both farmers would plow 40 acres of the same field, soil conditions identical, quality would be judged on straightness of rows, consistency of depth, uniformity of soil turnover, and time would be measured from first pass to last. Winner had to achieve both quality standards and finish first. If quality wasn't acceptable, the time didn't matter. Preston had immediately hired a professional tractor operator, a guy named Derek, who'd won state plowing competitions, figuring that the 8R410's technology plus Derek's expertise would be unbeatable. Walter would be operating the Farmall himself, 74 years old, with arthritic hands and a bad back, running a tractor with no power steering, no cab, no suspension, no GPS, nothing but a seat and a steering wheel, and 71 years of engineering. And when people asked him if he was worried about the physical demands of operating that tractor for however many hours it would take to plow 40 acres, Walter just said, "I've been doing it for 44 years. I think I can manage one more day." But privately, alone in his shed at night, Walter knew the truth. This wasn't about the tractor anymore. It was about proving that wisdom and experience and careful maintenance mattered more than horsepower and technology. It was about showing Preston and everyone like him that farming wasn't just about buying the newest equipment. It was about understanding the land and the work and the tools. And if Walter lost, if that Farmall couldn't compete, then Preston would be right. The old ways would be proven obsolete, and Walter's entire life philosophy would be invalidated in front of the whole county. The week between the challenge and the competition became the most talked-about event in Johnson County history, and Walter Morrison treated his preparation like he was preparing for war, spending every daylight hour in his shed with the Farmall M, going over every system with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. He started by draining all the fluids. Engine oil that was still clean from his last change just 200 hours ago, but he changed it anyway, wanted fresh oil for maximum lubrication, hydraulic fluid that he'd just serviced, but he replaced it to ensure perfect pressure, coolant that he flushed and refilled with fresh mix. He pulled every spark plug, checked the gap on each one, cleaned the electrodes with a wire brush until they gleamed, reinstalled them with precise torque.
He checked the magneto timing 3 times, adjusted the carburetor mixture with the kind of precision that required listening to the engine's rhythm like music, and spent 2 hours adjusting the governor until the engine held perfect RPMs under load. The plow he'd be using was a 2-bottom model he'd owned since 1985. Nothing fancy, but he spent a full day sharpening the blades until they could cut paper, adjusting the angle and depth mechanisms until they moved smoothly, greasing every pivot point, and checking that the hitch alignment was perfect because even a quarter degree off would affect the quality of his work over 40 acres. His grandson, Tommy, spent every afternoon after school in the shed, watching, asking questions, and finally, on Thursday, he asked the question that had been bothering him all week. "Grandpa, everyone says Preston's going to win because his tractor has so much more power. How are you going to beat him?" Walter was adjusting the clutch, his hands covered in grease. "Tommy, you know what the biggest advantage of new equipment is? Horsepower? That's what people think, but no. The biggest advantage is that everything is designed to be easy. Power steering, so you don't have to work to turn. Suspension, so you don't feel the bumps. GPS, so you don't have to think about keeping rows straight. It's all designed to make farming easier. And that's fine, but it also means the operator doesn't have to be as good. The tractor does the thinking for them." He straightened up, wiped his hands. Preston's hired Derek to run his tractor. Derek's a good operator, won competitions, but he's used to letting the technology do half the work. My Farmall doesn't have any of that, which means I have to be better than Derek, have to think ahead, plan every pass, maintain perfect depth and spacing by feel and experience, and that's my advantage. I've been doing this for 50 years. I know this tractor so well it's like an extension of my body. I can feel when the engine's working too hard, can tell by the sound when the plow depth is off by an inch, can keep perfectly straight rows without GPS because I've learned to use landmarks and feel. Tommy looked skeptical. "But Grandpa, Preston's tractor is 10 times more powerful. Even if you're better at operating, won't he just finish way faster?" Walter smiled, and it was a smile that suggested he knew something nobody else had figured out yet. "Power isn't everything, son. In fact, sometimes it's a disadvantage. Preston's tractor has so much horsepower that Derek can run it at maximum speed without thinking about efficiency. He'll probably plow at 7 or 8 miles per hour. Looks impressive, gets the work done fast, but here's what he won't be thinking about: fuel consumption. That 8R410 burns about 12 gallons per hour under heavy load. My Farmall burns 1.5 gallons per hour. Now, I'll be moving slower, probably 3 miles per hour, but I'll be running all day on 1 tank of fuel while Derek has to stop and refuel multiple times, and every time he stops, I'm still moving." He pulled out a piece of paper where he'd done calculations. "I figured Derek will need to refuel at least 4 times to finish 40 acres. Each refuel takes 15 to 20 minutes when you account for stopping, positioning the fuel truck, pumping, restarting, getting back to speed. That's over an hour of downtime. Meanwhile, I'll run straight through on my 40-gallon tank, and that's before we account for the fact that Derek doesn't know that field like I do." Tommy leaned forward, interested now. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've plowed Carl Johnson's 80-acre section probably 50 times over the last 40 years. I know where the wet spots are, where the ground is harder, where there's a slight rise that affects drainage. I know that the northeast corner has clay soil that needs to be plowed shallower or you'll bring up too much hardpan. I know the southwest section has better loam that can handle deeper plowing. Derek doesn't know any of that. He'll plow everything at the same depth because that's what the GPS tells him to do, and his work will be technically adequate, but not optimal, while I'll be adjusting depth and speed constantly based on conditions I've learned over decades." Meanwhile, across town at Blake Farm Equipment, Preston was doing the opposite of preparing. He was celebrating early, had invited friends over to his dealership on Thursday night, showing off the 8R410, letting them sit in the cab, explaining how the competition was going to be a massacre. "Honestly, I almost feel bad for the old man, but he challenged me, and I'm going to teach him and everyone watching that there's a reason we don't farm with 70-year-old equipment anymore." Derek, the operator Preston had hired, was more cautious. "Preston, I've heard stories about Walter Morrison. People say he can make that Farmall do things that shouldn't be possible." Preston waved him off. Those are just stories, old-timers romanticizing the past. You're in a 410 horsepower tractor with GPS guidance and auto steer. He's in a 38 horsepower antique with no technology at all. This isn't even going to be close. But Friday night, the evening before the competition, Preston couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the way Walter had smiled when accepting the challenge, the confidence in the old man's voice, the fact that Walter had somehow farmed 160 acres for 4 years with just that one tractor, which suggested maybe, just maybe, the old man knew something Preston didn't. And for the first time since making the bet, Preston felt a flutter of doubt in his stomach, a small voice asking, "What if you're wrong? What if there's more to farming than horsepower and technology? What if you just bet $10,000 and your reputation on assumptions that are about to be proven false in front of the entire county?" Saturday, August 19th, 2023 dawned clear and hot. Temperature already 78 degrees by 6 a.m. when people started arriving at Carl Johnson's farm, and by 7:30 when the competition was scheduled to start, there were over 500 people lining the field. Farmers who'd driven from 3 counties away, families with kids sitting on tailgates, news crews from 2 local stations, and enough pickup trucks parked along the road that the sheriff had to direct traffic. Walter arrived at 7:15 a.m. in his rust-pocked Ford Ranger, towing the Farmall M on a small flatbed trailer. And the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people applauded, appreciating the underdog spirit, but others laughed or shook their heads, because next to Preston's gleaming John Deere 8R410, which had arrived on a professional equipment trailer at 7, Walter's rig looked like something from a different century. The tractors were positioned at opposite ends of the 80-acre field. Each would plow 40 acres, working toward the middle. Judges had marked the boundary line, and the rules were simple. Start on the judge's signal, first one to complete their 40 acres with acceptable quality won. Quality would be judged on row straightness within 2 inches of tolerance, consistent depth within 1 inch of variance, and uniform soil turnover with no skipped sections. Preston stood next to his John Deere wearing designer sunglasses and a new Blake Equipment polo shirt, talking to Derek, who was already in the cab familiarizing himself with the controls. And when a reporter asked Preston if he was confident, he'd said, "I'm not confident, I'm certain. That Farmall is a museum piece. This is going to be over by lunch." Walter, by contrast, was sitting on his Farmall's worn metal seat, doing what he'd done for 44 years before every job, running through a mental checklist, checking oil pressure by watching the gauge, listening to the engine's rhythm for any irregularity, feeling the clutch engagement, testing the hydraulic response. And when his wife Eleanor came over with a thermos of coffee, he smiled at her and said, "Don't worry, Ellie, I know what I'm doing." At 7:50 a.m., the head judge, a county extension agent named Robert Mills, gathered both operators for final instructions, and when he asked if there were any questions, Derek asked, "Are we limited on speed?" And Robert said, "No speed limits, but remember, quality matters as much as time. If your work doesn't meet standards, finishing first means nothing." At exactly 8 a.m., Robert fired a starting pistol, and the competition began. Derek immediately pushed the John Deere to 7 miles per hour, the massive tractor tearing through the field with its 6-bottom plow, turning soil in wide, impressive passes, the GPS guidance keeping the rows laser straight, and the crowd watching Preston's section gasped at the sheer power and speed of the modern machine. Walter, meanwhile, started at a methodical 3 miles per hour, his 2-bottom plow turning much narrower strips, and to anyone watching casually, it looked like he was already hopelessly behind. By the time Walter completed his first pass, Derek had completed 2 and was starting his third. Preston was standing with a group of his friends, pointing at the 2 tractors. "See that? Derek's already done twice as much. This is exactly what I've been trying to tell people. Modern equipment isn't just better, it's exponentially better." By 9 a.m., Derek had completed roughly a quarter of his 40 acres, while Walter had completed maybe an eighth, and the math seemed brutal. If the pace continued, Derek would finish around 1 p.m., while Walter wouldn't finish until 4 or later, and people were already pulling out their phones to post on social media about how the competition was exactly what everyone expected, a total mismatch. But 3 people in that crowd weren't so sure. Tom Bradley, who'd farmed neighboring land for 30 years and knew the Johnson field intimately, was watching Walter's passes with narrowed eyes and noticing something the casual observers missed. Walter was adjusting his depth constantly, plowing deeper in the loose soil sections and shallower where the ground was harder, maintaining perfect consistency in the actual soil turnover even though the plow depth varied, and that took skill you couldn't buy. Eleanor Morrison, who'd watched her husband farm for 50 years, was watching the John Deere and noticed that Derek was plowing everything at exactly the same depth regardless of conditions, which meant his quality would be consistent but not optimal, and she wondered if the judges would catch that. And Tommy, Walter's grandson, was watching his grandfather's face and seeing something he'd seen before when Walter was doing complex work: complete concentration, the old man's entire being focused on the task, reading the soil through the plow's feedback, listening to the engine's response, making constant tiny adjustments that added up to perfection. At 10 a.m., the dynamic shifted slightly when Derek had to stop for his first refueling. The John Deere's fuel tank had run dry after 2 hours of hard work, and Preston's crew brought up a fuel truck, but the refueling process took 18 minutes because they had to position the truck carefully, pump 150 gallons, and then Derek had to restart and get back up to speed. During those 18 minutes, Walter never stopped, kept plowing at his steady 3 miles per hour, and the gap that had seemed insurmountable started to shrink just slightly. By 11 a.m., Derek was approaching halfway done with his section, but Walter was now at about 30% complete, and the math was starting to look different. Derek was still ahead, but not by as much as the raw horsepower suggested he should be. At 11:45, Derek had to refuel again, another 15 minutes of downtime, and during that stop, Preston's confidence wavered for the first time. He pulled Robert Mills aside and asked, "The old man's work, is it meeting quality standards?" Robert had been watching both sections closely. "Walter's work is exceptional, actually. Some of the best plowing I've seen. Depth is perfectly consistent, rows are straight as an arrow, soil turnover is uniform. If anything, his quality is better than Derek's." Preston's stomach dropped. Better? How is that possible? Robert shrugged. Experience. Walter's adjusting for soil conditions constantly. Derek's just running GPS lines. Technically adequate, but not optimized. At noon, with the sun blazing and the temperature pushing 95 degrees, Derek was at about 70% complete, but visibly tiring. 3 hours of fighting the steering wheel, even with power assist, was exhausting, while Walter, despite being 40 years older, looked exactly the same as when he'd started: focused, methodical, adjusting constantly, and now at about 55% complete.
The crowd was getting restless. Phones were coming out. People were recalculating. And suddenly, the impossible was starting to look merely improbable. Walter was gaining ground, and if Derek had to refuel 2 more times while Walter could run straight through, this competition might actually be close. At 1:15 p.m., Derek finished his 40 acres, shut down the John Deere, and climbed out of the cab with a triumphant fist pump that the crowd answered with applause. Because even though many of them were rooting for Walter, there was no denying that Derek had done impressive work. 40 acres plowed in just over 5 hours, and Preston was already celebrating, shaking Derek's hand, posting on Facebook that the competition was over, that modern equipment had proven superior, that Walter still had about 12 acres to go and would probably take another 2 hours to finish. But Tom Bradley, standing near the judges' table, was watching Robert Mills examine Derek's section with a measuring wheel and a soil probe, and Tom could see Robert's expression getting more troubled with each measurement. At 1:30 p.m., Walter was at 38 acres, complete with 2 acres remaining, still moving at his steady 3-mile-per-hour pace, still adjusting constantly, and the Farmall M's engine was still purring with the same rhythm it had started with 6 hours ago. No strain, no overheating, no problems. At 2:47 p.m., Walter completed his final pass, shut down the Farmall, and slowly climbed down from the seat, his legs stiff from 6 hours and 47 minutes of continuous operation, and the crowd gave him a standing ovation not because he'd won, everyone assumed he'd lost by nearly an hour and a half, but because he'd finished it all, because a 74-year-old man had just plowed 40 acres on a 71-year-old tractor without quitting. Preston walked over, extended his hand with a magnanimous smile. "Walter, I've got to hand it to you. That old tractor held together. You should be proud. Now about that $10,000. "The judges haven't announced a winner yet," Walter interrupted, breathing hard but standing straight. Preston's smile faltered. "Walter, I finished almost 2 hours before you. Time was part of the criteria." "So was quality," Walter said quietly. Robert Mills approached with his clipboard and a serious expression that made Preston's stomach clench. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss the results.
The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. "Mr. Blake," Robert said, "your operator completed the course in 5 hours and 17 minutes. That's excellent time. However, our quality inspection revealed several issues." Preston's face went pale. "What issues?" Robert consulted his notes. "Your plow depth varied by up to 4 inches across different soil types. In the northeast section, where there's clay subsoil, the plowing was too deep and brought up excessive hardpan. In the southwest section, the depth was inconsistent, and we found 3 areas totaling approximately 0.8 acres where the soil turnover was inadequate. Still met minimum standards, but below optimal." Preston's voice rose. "But it was acceptable. You said it met standards." "It met minimum standards, yes, but the criteria stated quality matters as much as time. Now, Mr. Morrison," Walter turned to Walter, "your time was 6 hours and 47 minutes, considerably slower. However, your quality inspection revealed something remarkable. Your plow depth was consistent within half an inch across all 40 acres, despite varying soil conditions. Your rows are straight within half an inch tolerance, and your soil turnover is uniformly excellent across the entire section, with 0 deficiencies." The crowd went dead silent.
"In fact," Robert continued, "I've been judging plowing competitions for 15 years, and I've never seen work this precise, Mr. Morrison. You somehow managed to adjust for every soil variation in this field, which suggests intimate knowledge of the land and exceptional operational skill." Preston's voice was desperate now. "But he finished almost 2 hours slower. Time was part of the competition." Robert nodded. "It was, which is why we have to make a determination about which matters more, speed with adequate quality or slower work with exceptional quality. However, there's another factor we need to consider. Fuel efficiency was not explicitly in the rules, but it's worth noting that Mr. Blake's tractor consumed approximately 78 gallons of diesel to complete 40 acres, while Mr. Morrison's tractor consumed 11 gallons. The crowd gasped, and someone did the math out loud. "That's 7 times more fuel." Robert looked at both men. "Gentlemen, the judges have conferred, and we've made our decision based on the totality of the criteria: quality of work, time of completion, and overall farming efficiency. The winner of this competition is Walter Morrison." The crowd exploded, half of them cheering wildly, the other half standing in stunned silence, and Preston's face went from pale to red to purple. "That's ridiculous. This was about time and quality, not fuel costs. We didn't agree to judge fuel efficiency." Robert's voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Blake, you challenged Mr. Morrison to prove which equipment was better. We judged which equipment performed better overall. Mr. Morrison's 40 acres are plowed to a higher quality standard, used a fraction of the fuel, and while yes, it took longer, the efficiency and precision more than compensate for the time difference. This is what good farming looks like, not just fast farming." Preston was shaking with rage. "I'm not paying $10,000 because of some technicality about fuel costs that wasn't in the original rules." Walter spoke for the first time since the judgment, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent crowd. "Preston, you challenged me because you wanted to prove that old equipment is obsolete, that farmers like me are stuck in the past, that new technology is always better. But what you proved today is something different. You proved that farming isn't about horsepower or GPS or spending $500,000 on a tractor. It's about understanding your land, maintaining your equipment, working efficiently, and having the skill to do the job right. Your tractor is impressive, but Derek ran it like he was in a race instead of farming, plowed everything the same depth regardless of soil conditions, burned through fuel like it was free, and produced work that met minimum standards but wasn't optimal." He took a step toward Preston. "My Farmall is 71 years old, cost me $800 44 years ago, and today it proved that with proper maintenance and operator skill, old equipment can not only compete with new equipment, it can beat it on the metrics that actually matter: quality, efficiency, and understanding the work. So yes, Preston, you owe me $10,000, but more importantly, you owe everyone here an apology for spending 20 years telling them that the only way to farm successfully is to buy expensive new equipment from you.